Hello and thank you for joining for tonight's stories. I hope you enjoy. The Agreement. The blade sang against the whetstone, a high, thin note that cut through the darkness of Ross Graham's remote outpost cabin. 53 kilometers from the nearest paved road, 22 years into his tenure as a park ranger for the vast Canadian wilderness, Ross had learned to find comfort in small rituals. The rhythmic scrape of steel against stone, the crackle of pine in the wood stove, the distant howl of wolves that reminded him he was not alone, not truly, in this endless sea of ancient forest. He was 47 years old, his beard more gray than brown now, his hands mapped with scars from 2 decades of clearing trails and rescuing lost hikers. The outpost at Mount Kitchai was his domain, his kingdom of spruce and cedar, of black bears and elk and the occasional cougar. He knew these mountains the way a man knows his own reflection, intimately, completely, with all its flaws and hidden depths. But tonight something felt wrong. The radio had been nothing but static for 3 hours. Not unusual this deep in the mountains, where granite peaks interfered with signals, where atmospheric conditions could turn a clear transmission into electronic snow. But Ross had developed instincts over the years, a primal sense that existed below conscious thought, and those instincts were screaming at him now. He paused in his sharpening, holding the hunting knife up to the firelight. The edge gleamed wicked sharp, capable of field dressing an elk or defending against a predator. Ross had never needed it for the latter, not in 20 years. The animals of these woods respected boundaries. They kept to their territories, their patterns, their ancient agreements with the human interlopers who passed through their realm. Something moved in the forest beyond his window. Ross didn't turn his head. Experience had taught him that peripheral vision often caught what direct sight missed. He kept his eyes on the blade, his body still, his ears straining against the silence. The fire popped, sending a constellation of sparks up the chimney. Outside, the wind. No, there was no wind. The trees should have been moving, should have been whispering their endless secrets to the night. But the forest had gone still, completely, unnaturally still. Ross had experienced this phenomenon once before, 12 years ago during a late autumn patrol. The silence had preceded a magnitude 4.2 earthquake, a tremor that had shaken loose boulders and sent them crashing down the eastern slope of Mount Kitchai. He had learned to trust the silence. The silence meant something was coming. He set down the knife and moved to the window, his boots heavy on the plank floor. The glass was cold against his forehead as he peered out into the darkness. His cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by old-growth forest that had stood for 3 centuries or more. The moon was new tonight, offering no illumination, and his eyes could penetrate only 10 meters into the absolute blackness beyond the reach of his firelight. Then he heard it. A sound almost human, almost. It started as a low moan, rising in pitch, transforming into something that might have been a word in a language Ross didn't recognize. It came from the northeast, from the direction of the old-growth sector that hadn't seen human feet in decades. The sound held notes of grief, of warning, of ancient rage. It was not the call of any animal Ross had catalogued in 22 years of wilderness observation. Not elk, not wolf, not cougar, not bear. Not any bird he knew, not any mammal, not any creature that belonged to the natural order of these mountains. It was something else. Ross stepped back from the window, his hand finding the radio microphone automatically. He keyed it twice, the standard check-in pattern, and waited for the response that didn't come. Just static. Endless, hissing static that seemed almost to form patterns, almost to carry voices beneath its white noise surface. He would report this in the morning. Drive the 30 kilometers to the relay station, file an incident report, describe the sound in the clinical language of government forms. Unidentified vocalization, northeast sector. Recommend further investigation. But for now, Ross Graham did what he had always done when the wilderness showed him its mysteries. He banked the fire, checked the locks on his doors and windows, and went to bed with his hunting knife within arm's reach. Sleep did not come easily. Dawn broke gray and cold, the sky the color of wet slate. Ross emerged from his cabin into air that tasted of pine resin and impending snow. He performed his morning rituals automatically, checking the weather station, recording the temperature and wind speed, noting the barometric pressure that had dropped significantly overnight. A storm was building somewhere to the west, still days away but gathering strength across the Pacific. He prepared his patrol pack with the efficiency of long practice. First aid kit, emergency beacon, topographical maps, GPS unit, water purification tablets, 3 days of rations. The hunting knife, now razor-sharp, sheathed at his hip. A satellite phone that might or might not find a signal in the valleys between peaks. And his grandfather's compass, an antique brass instrument that had guided 3 generations of Grahams through wilderness from Alberta to the Yukon. Ross intended to patrol the northeast sector today. Officially, he would be checking for illegal hunting blinds, for signs of poaching, for the marijuana grows that occasionally appeared in remote clearings. Unofficially, he would be investigating the sound, the almost human sound that had echoed through his dreams, transforming into something that stood at the edge of his consciousness, just out of sight, watching him with eyes that glowed like dying embers. He set out at 700 hours, following the established trail that wound through secondary growth forest before climbing toward the old growth boundary. The first hour of hiking was uneventful. Squirrels chattered overhead. A woodpecker hammered against a dead snag, seeking the insects that lived in the decaying heartwood. The trail was well maintained here, cleared of windfall, marked with blazes that Ross himself had refreshed last spring. But as he approached the boundary between managed forest and true wilderness, Ross noticed something that made him stop in his tracks. A path, overgrown, almost invisible but definitely a path. It branched off from the main trail at a sharp angle, heading due northeast into the densest part of the old growth. Ross consulted his maps, his GPS, his memory of 22 years in these mountains. There was no recorded trail here. No maintenance schedule, no hiker log, no official documentation of any route through this sector. He stepped closer, pushing through a curtain of hanging moss that dripped with morning condensation. The path existed. He could see it now, a narrow track where the undergrowth had been pressed down, where branches had been broken or bent aside. The vegetation was disturbed in a pattern that suggested regular use, but not by anything that wore boots. The footprints, where the mud allowed them to be preserved, were enormous. Ross knelt beside one clear impression, his heart beginning to beat faster. He was no tracker, not really, but he knew the signs of the animals that shared his domain. This was not bear. The toes were too long, too distinct. The arch was wrong, the heel too narrow. And the size, he measured it against his own boot, size 11, and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. The print was nearly twice the length of his foot. He should turn back. This was the protocol, drilled into every park ranger from their first day of training. Unidentified large mammal, possible safety hazard, do not engage, report to superiors, await instructions. Ross had followed that protocol a dozen times over the years, marking bear dens for closure, reporting cougar sightings to warn hikers, establishing exclusion zones around aggressive elk during rutting season. But the path called to him. The mystery of it, the impossibility of it, the sheer wrongness of a trail that shouldn't exist in a sector he had patrolled for 2 decades. And beneath all of that, something else. A sense of obligation, almost of duty. The sound from last night had been a summons. This path was the answer. Ross checked his radio, still nothing but static, and stepped onto the overgrown track. The forest closed around him like a mouth. The path was narrow, forcing him to turn sideways to pass between ancient trees whose trunks were thicker than his outstretched arms could reach. The canopy above was complete, a ceiling of green that blocked the gray sky and transformed day into perpetual twilight. Moss grew thick on every surface, softening sound. absorbing the crunch of his boots on the needle-strewn ground. He walked for 20 minutes, then 30, following the path as it wound through terrain that grew increasingly rugged. The undergrowth thinned as the trees grew larger, their root systems dominating the soil to the exclusion of lesser plants. Ross found himself in a cathedral of wood and shadow, walking on a floor of packed earth that had not seen sunlight in centuries. Then the birds stopped singing. It happened gradually, so gradually that Ross didn't notice at first. The chickadees that had been flitting through the branches overhead fell silent. The nuthatches ceased their nasal calls. Even the insects, the ever-present hum of mosquitoes and black flies that plagued every summer hike, seemed to vanish. The silence was absolute, pressing against his eardrums like water pressure at depth. Ross stopped, his hand finding the handle of his knife. The silence was wrong. He had experienced quiet in the wilderness before, the hush of deep winter when even the squirrels slept, the stillness of a snowfall that muffled all sound. But this was different. This was the silence of something holding its breath, of something waiting. He turned in a slow circle, his eyes scanning the shadows between the massive trunks. The trees were too close together here, their branches interlocking 50 feet above the ground, creating a maze of darkness and half-light. Anything could be hiding in those shadows. Anything at all. Something moved. Ross caught it at the edge of his vision, a shift of darkness against darkness, a suggestion of mass and motion that disappeared when he turned his head. His heart hammered against his ribs. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think clearly. It could be a bear. Black bears were common in these mountains, and a large male could appear almost black in the dim light, could move with surprising speed and silence. But bears didn't walk upright, and whatever Ross had glimpsed had been standing tall, taller than a man, taller than any man had a right to be. He took a step backward, intending to retreat along the path, to return to the safety of his maintained trail and his radio and the world of documented phenomena. But his boot struck something hard, something that hadn't been there a moment before. Ross looked down. A stone marker, 3 flat rocks, each one larger than the last, stacked in a crude pyramid. The top stone was dark with what might have been moss or might have been something else entirely. The stack was deliberate, purposeful, placed precisely in the center of the path where Ross would have to see it, would have to acknowledge it. He knew this structure. He had seen photographs in books about the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, about the First Nations who had inhabited these mountains for 10,000 years before European settlers arrived. Inukshuk, some called them. Stone sentinels, markers of sacred ground, of territorial boundaries, of places where the veil between worlds grew thin. But this was different. The books showed graceful structures, balanced stones, works of art and spirituality. This was crude, almost violent in its construction. The rocks were chipped and broken, forced together rather than placed. And the top stone, the dark stone, seemed to absorb the dim light rather than reflect it. Ross reached out, his hand moving without conscious decision, and touched the marker. The stone was warm. Not warm from sunlight, there was no sunlight here, warm like flesh, warm like something that had been alive until recently. Ross jerked his hand back, his skin crawling with revulsion, and in his haste he kicked the bottom stone. The marker collapsed, the rocks tumbling into the path with a sound like breaking bones. The forest erupted. It started as a single sound, a heavy impact against wood, the kind of sound a massive fist might make striking a tree trunk. Then another, and suddenly the woods were alive with percussion, with rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ross spun around, his knife drawn now, his back against the nearest tree as the sound surrounded him. Thump, thump, thump. Perfectly synchronized, perfectly rhythmic. Not the random sounds of animals communicating, but something deliberate, something organized. A language of wood and force, spoken by something that knew he was there, that had been waiting for him to make exactly the mistake he had just made. The thumping grew louder, closer, and beneath it Ross could hear something else. Movement in the undergrowth. Heavy footsteps that matched the rhythm of the wood knocks, step thump, approaching from multiple directions. The shadows between the trees seemed to deepen, to coalesce, to take on mass and form. Ross ran. He didn't think about protocol, about documentation, about the scientific method and rational explanations. He ran like his ancestors had run from predators on the savannah, like prey runs from the certainty of death. The path that had led him in twisted now to lead him out, and he followed it without thought, branches whipping against his face, roots threatening to trip him with every step. Behind him the thumping continued, but it was changing, becoming faster, more excited. Whatever was making that sound was pleased that he was running. It wanted him to run. The realization hit Ross like a physical blow, and he almost stumbled, almost stopped, but momentum carried him forward and fear kept him moving. He burst from the tree line into the secondary growth forest, and the sounds faded behind him. Not stopped, faded. As if whatever had been pursuing him had reached an invisible boundary and chosen not to cross. Ross didn't stop to analyze this. He kept running, his lungs burning, his legs trembling with adrenaline and exertion, until he reached the maintained trail and then his cabin, and then the sanctuary of 4 walls and a locked door. He collapsed against that door, sliding down to sit on the floor, his knife still clutched in a white-knuckled grip. The sun was high now, midday light streaming through the windows, and the ordinary sounds of the forest had returned. Birds sang. Insects buzzed. The world had returned to normal. But Ross Graham knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones like winter cold, that he had crossed a line today. He had trespassed where he was not welcome. He had broken something ancient and powerful, something that had been in place since before his grandfather's grandfather was born. And now, whatever he had disturbed was waiting for him to make his next move. The agreement had been broken, and there would be a price to pay. The afternoon passed in a blur of activity that served no real purpose. Ross tried the radio again and again, achieving nothing but different flavors of static. He attempted to hike out to the relay station, but found himself turning back after only 2 kilometers, unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was waiting in the shadows of the trail ahead. He reviewed his maps, searching for any notation of the path he had found, any indication that other rangers had explored the northeast sector and found something worth recording. There was nothing. The area was marked as old growth, restricted access, with no trails, no campsites, no points of interest. It was a blank space on the map, an absence of information that seemed to pulse with significance. As the sun began to set, Ross found himself unable to leave the cabin. He told himself he was being cautious, that night travel in the mountains was dangerous even without the added factor of unidentified large mammals. But the truth was simpler and more shameful. He was afraid of the darkness that was gathering outside his windows, afraid of the silence that would fall when the birds stopped singing. He built up the fire until it roared in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He checked his supplies, his rifle, locked in the cabinet, his ammunition, his emergency flares. He told himself he was prepared for anything, that he was a professional, that 22 years of wilderness experience meant something. But when the sun finally set and the darkness pressed against his windows like a physical force, Ross Graham felt like a child again, alone in the night, listening for the monsters under his bed. They came at moonrise. Ross didn't see them at first. He was sitting by the fire, ostensibly cleaning his rifle but actually staring into the flames when he heard the first sound. A scratching, soft, deliberate, coming from the north wall of the cabin, the wall that faced the old-growth forest. He froze, his hand still on the rifle barrel, every sense suddenly alert. The scratching continued, moving along the wall, following the log construction. It sounded like fingernails on wood, but the nails would have to be iron-hard, the fingers massive, to make that sound against the treated timber of the cabin walls. Then it stopped, and from the darkness outside, Ross heard something that made his blood run cold. Laughter. Not human laughter. Something that was trying to sound human, that had heard human laughter and was approximating it, the way a parrot approximates speech. The sound was wrong in ways Ross couldn't articulate, too deep and too high at the same time, with harmonics that seemed to come from multiple throats. It rose and fell, mocking, triumphant, and beneath it Ross could hear movement. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin. More than one set, many more. He moved to the window, keeping low, his rifle ready. The moon had risen full and bright, casting silver light across the clearing, and in that light Ross saw them. Shadows, too tall for men, too broad for bears, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of power and intelligence. They circled his cabin in a slow procession, staying just at the edge of the tree line where the darkness was thickest, but occasionally one would step into the moonlight and Ross would catch a glimpse of what he was facing. Fur, matted dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Arms that hung too long, that ended in hands with too many fingers. And eyes, glowing amber eyes that reflected the moon like a predator's, that fixed on the cabin with an intensity that spoke of hunger and hatred and something worse, recognition. They knew him. They had been waiting for him. One of them approached the window where Ross crouched. It moved silently, impossibly silently for something so large, and Ross found himself staring into a face that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. It was almost human. The structure was there. Eyes, nose, mouth, the general arrangement of features. But everything was wrong. The proportions were distorted, stretched, as if the face had been molded from clay by hands that had only heard descriptions of humanity. The eyes were too far apart, the mouth too wide, the teeth. The teeth were black, rotten, too many of them crowded into gums that wept with some dark infection. And when the creature smiled, Ross saw that it was smiling at him, with recognition, with pleasure. It raised one massive hand and tapped on the glass. 3 times, the same rhythm as the wood knocks in the forest. Thump, thump, thump. Then it pressed its face against the window, its breath fogging the glass, and spoke. The words were garbled, distorted, formed by a mouth not designed for human speech. But Ross understood them anyway, heard them not with his ears but with something deeper, something that recognized the language of threat and territory and ancient rage. Broken, the thing said. Agreement broken, you took, path you broke, stone, now price. Ross stumbled backward, his rifle clattering to the floor. The creature watched him with those terrible amber eyes, and then it did something that was somehow worse than any threat. It stepped back from the window. It rejoined the circle of shadows, and together, as one, the creatures turned and walked into the forest. They didn't run. They didn't attack. They simply left as if they had accomplished what they came to do, as if they had delivered their message and were now content to wait. Ross didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, his rifle across his knees, watching the windows until dawn grayed the sky. When the sun finally rose, he ventured outside to examine the cabin's perimeter. What he found made him vomit into the bushes. Footprints, dozens of them, massive impressions in the soft earth, circling the cabin, pressing close to the walls. But it was the prints inside the cabin that made Ross's mind rebel against what his eyes were showing him. They were on his doorstep, inside the threshold, inside his home. The door had been locked all night. He was certain of it. He had checked it a dozen times, had heard the bolt slide home, had tested the handle, but the mud on the floorboards told a different story. Something had entered his cabin while he slept, or while he thought he was awake. Something had stood in his home, had walked across his floor, had left its mark in the dust and the shadows. The message was clear. They could have taken him any time. They had chosen not to. They were giving him a chance to make things right, to restore what had been broken, to pay the price for his trespass. Ross Graham had never been a religious man. He believed in what he could see and measure and document. But standing in his cabin, staring at footprints that shouldn't exist, he felt the weight of something ancient pressing down on him. Something that had been here long before humans named these mountains, that would be here long after the last trace of civilization had crumbled to dust. He needed help, not from his superiors in the Park Service, who would send sociologists and anthropologists and scientists who would measure and categorize and explain away the impossible. He needed help from someone who understood the old ways, someone who knew about agreements and prices and the things that lived in the spaces between the trees. He needed to find Kitchai Longstrider, and he needed to do it before the sun set again. Kitchai Longstrider lived 30 kilometers north of Ross's outpost, in a valley that didn't appear on any official map. The old man had refused relocation when the Park Service expanded their boundaries in the 1980s, had rejected the government's offers of compensation and resettlement, had simply stayed in the home his great-grandfather built and dared anyone to make him leave. After a decade of legal battles and one near-disastrous attempt at forced removal, the Park Service had quietly redrawn their maps, creating an exclusion zone around Kitchai's land that remained in effect to this day. Ross had met the old man twice before. Once, during his first year as a ranger, when he had stumbled onto Kitchai's property while tracking a wounded elk. The second time, 5 years ago, when a hiker had gone missing in the northern sector, and Kitchai had appeared at Ross's cabin with information that had led them to the body. Both encounters had left Ross with the distinct impression that Kitchai Longstrider knew things about these mountains that no government training could teach. The trail to Kitchai's home was unmarked, winding through terrain that grew increasingly rugged as Ross traveled north. He moved as fast as safety allowed, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows, his ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The forest seemed normal today. Birds sang, squirrels chattered, the wind moved through the branches with its usual whisper. But Ross couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something was keeping pace with him, just out of sight, waiting for him to make another mistake. He reached Kitchai's valley at midday. The old man's home was a log cabin that looked older than the mountains themselves, smoke rising from a stone chimney, a garden of medicinal herbs growing in ordered rows beside a clear stream. An elderly woman, Kitchai's wife, Ross assumed, was hanging laundry on a line, and she watched him approach with eyes that held no welcome. "He's been expecting you," she said before Ross could speak. "Go inside and leave your rifle on the porch." Ross hesitated, his hand tight on the weapon. The memory of last night was still fresh, the amber eyes and black teeth, and the sound of something trying to laugh like a human. But the woman's expression brooked no argument, and Ross found himself unshouldering the rifle and leaning it against the cabin wall. The interior was dim and warm, smelling of wood smoke and drying herbs and something else, something musky and wild that made Ross think of fur and forest floors. Kitchai Longstrider sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket despite the warmth, his ancient face a map of wrinkles that might have been carved by wind and time. "Sit," the old man said, gesturing to a stool. "You look like a man who's seen the forest's true face." Ross sat. The words came out in a rush, the whole story pouring from him, the sound in the night, the overgrown path, the stone marker, the wood knocks, the creatures at his window, the footprints inside his cabin. Kitchai listened without expression, his dark eyes never leaving Ross's face, and when Ross finally ran out of words, the old man was silent for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was the laugh of someone who had seen this before, who had warned against this exact outcome, who was now watching the consequences unfold exactly as predicted. "You broke the agreement," Kitchai said. "You walked where humans don't walk, you touched what humans don't touch, and now they know your name, Ranger. They know your face. They know the taste of your fear." "What agreement?" Ross asked. "What are they?" Kitchai's expression grew serious. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the room despite its softness. "The Sasquatch," he said. "The old ones, the forest people. They have many names in many languages. My people called them the Stick Indians, the Wood Men, the ones who walk between. They were here before the first human set foot in these mountains. They watched the glaciers retreat. They saw the mammoths die. And they made an agreement with the first of my ancestors who wandered into their territory." "An agreement about what?" "About boundaries," Kitchai said. "About respect, about the price of trespass. The Sasquatch are territorial spirits, Ranger. Not animals, though they wear flesh like animals. Not gods, though they have power like gods. They are the forest's immune system, its defense against the disease of human expansion. And they have rules. Rules that humans break at their peril." Ross thought of the path, the marker, the way the creatures had circled his cabin. "The stone," he said. "The marker I knocked over, that was part of the agreement." "That was the agreement," Kitchai corrected. "The stones mark the boundary between human territory and theirs. They are placed with ceremony, with prayer, with offerings of respect. To disturb them is to declare war. To break them is to invite death." "But I didn't know," Ross protested. "I didn't mean." "They don't care what you meant," Kitchai interrupted. "They care what you did. And what you did was declare that human rules apply in their domain, that human presence is welcome where it is forbidden, that the ancient boundaries mean nothing to the modern world." The old man stood, moving to a chest in the corner of the cabin. He returned with a bundle wrapped in deerskin which he unrolled on the floor between them. Inside were objects that made Ross's skin crawl: a claw, curved and yellowed with age; a handful of coarse hair, dark and matted; a stone that seemed to pulse with its own dim light. "There is a way to make peace," Kitchai said. "A ritual of restitution, but it must be done exactly with exact intent. One mistake and the agreement is void. They will take you, Ranger. They will take you into the deep woods and no one will ever find your bones." Ross swallowed hard. "What do I have to do?" "First, you must make an offering. Raw venison, fresh killed, left at the boundary where you trespassed. This shows that you understand they are predators, that you acknowledge their power over life and death. Second, you must speak the words of apology. In Cree, their language, the language of the first agreement. You must say them exactly as I teach you, with the exact pronunciation, the exact rhythm. Third, you must vow never to return to that path, never to enter their territory again, never to speak of what you have seen to anyone who would not understand." "And if I do all that?" Kitchai's eyes were ancient and sad. "Then perhaps they will accept your apology. Perhaps they will restore the agreement with you as a signatory. But Ranger," he reached out, his hand gripping Ross's wrist with surprising strength, "they will be watching. Forever. They know you now. They will never forget. And if you break your vow, if you trespass again, if you speak when you should be silent." "I understand," Ross said. But he didn't. Not really. Not until that night when he stood at the boundary of the old-growth forest with a freshly killed deer at his feet and the words of apology stumbling from his lips in a language he barely spoke. The ritual was simple in description, terrifying in execution. Ross had spent the afternoon hunting, tracking a young buck through the secondary growth, making the kill with a single shot that echoed through the hills. He had field-dressed the animal with shaking hands, leaving the meat raw and bloody as Kitchai had instructed, carrying the carcass to the place where the overgrown path began. Now he stood in darkness that was somehow deeper than night should allow, the trees around him pressing close, the silence absolute. He had built no fire. Kitchai had forbidden it. The offering must be made in darkness, in cold, in the true conditions of the forest. "Nimisak," he began, the Cree words feeling foreign and clumsy on his tongue. "I am sorry. I did not know. I will not return." The words Kitchai had taught him were longer, more complex, carrying meanings that Ross could only approximate. He stumbled through them, his voice cracking, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. The deer lay at his feet, its blood still warm, steam rising from its body into the cold air. "Kakikare kawi nipamihawak," he continued. "I respect your territory, I acknowledge your power, I beg for forgiveness." Something moved in the trees. Ross froze, his voice dying in his throat. The darkness seemed to coalesce, to take on shape and mass. He could feel them watching him, feel their amber eyes fixed on his trembling form, their attention like a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He forced himself to continue. "Maka nimanihequerwak, I will not return, I will not speak, I will remember." The silence stretched, endless and suffocating. Ross stood motionless, his heart hammering, his breath coming in shallow gasps that fogged the air. He couldn't see them, but he knew they were there. Knew they were considering his offering, weighing his words, deciding whether his apology was sufficient. Then the wood knocks began. Thump, thump, thump. Not the chaotic, threatening rhythm of his first encounter. This was slower, deliberate, almost Ross hardly dared to think it accepting. The sound came from multiple directions surrounding him, but there was no sense of threat in it now. Only acknowledgement, only response. The deer carcass shifted. Ross blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks in the darkness. But no, the deer was moving, sliding across the ground as if pulled by invisible hands, moving toward the tree line and the path beyond. He watched it disappear into the shadows, heard the soft sounds of something large consuming raw meat, and then the forest was silent again. But different, the silence had changed. Where before it had been the silence of held breath, of waiting threat, now it was the silence of completion, of transaction. The agreement had been acknowledged. The price had been paid. Ross turned to leave, and that was when he saw the stones. They had moved. The rocks he had knocked over, the crude marker he had destroyed, they were standing again, but not as they had been. The crude pyramid was gone, replaced by something else. A spiral. The stones arranged in a spiral pattern that led from the path into the forest, curving away into darkness, inviting him to follow. He didn't. He ran this time all the way back to his cabin, not stopping until he was inside with the door locked and the fire roaring. But even there, safe in his sanctuary, he could feel the spiral pulling at him, could feel the invitation that had been extended. They wanted him to follow, wanted to show him something. But Ross Graham, for all his courage, for all his 22 years in the wilderness, was not brave enough to accept that invitation. He never went back to that path, never spoke of what he had seen to his superiors, to his colleagues, to anyone who would not understand. He transferred to a different sector the following spring, taking a position at a ranger station 50 kilometers south, where the mountains were younger and the forests less ancient. But he never forgot, and sometimes on nights when the wind was right and the moon was full, he would stand on his porch and listen. Listen for the wood knocks that never came. Listen for the footsteps that never approached. Listen for the sound of something almost human calling from the darkness. They were still watching. He knew that, would always know that. The agreement had been restored, but it had been changed. Ross Graham was no longer just a ranger, just a man. He was a signatory now, a witness, a human who had looked into the amber eyes of the forest and survived. And in the deep woods, where the trees grew so close that sunlight never touched the ground, the Sasquatch remembered his name. Years passed. Ross aged, his hair turning fully gray, his body accumulating the aches and pains of a life spent outdoors. He retired from the Park Service at 65, moved to a small town on the edge of the wilderness, bought a cabin with a view of the mountains he had once patrolled. He became a consultant, occasionally helping with search and rescue operations, training young rangers in the skills he had spent a lifetime acquiring. He never returned to Mount Kitchai, never hiked the trails he had once known by heart. The northeast sector became, in his mind, a blank space, a territory marked with warning signs he could not ignore. He told himself he was being prudent, respecting the boundaries he had sworn to uphold. But in his dreams, he still walked that overgrown path, still saw the spiral of stones, still felt the invitation that he had been too afraid to accept. The years turned him from a middle-aged ranger into an old man. His wife died, cancer taking her quickly and quietly, leaving him alone in the cabin with his memories and his silence. His children visited when they could, grandchildren who found him strange and distant, who whispered about his episodes when they thought he couldn't hear. He didn't mind. The solitude suited him. The mountains were still there, visible from his porch, and he could watch them without needing to enter them, could remember without needing to experience. The agreement held. The price had been paid. He was safe. Or so he believed. The hikers were lost. That was the report that came to Ross's door on an autumn afternoon, 5 years into his retirement. A group of tourists from Ontario, inexperienced, poorly equipped, who had wandered off the marked trails and found themselves in terrain they couldn't navigate. The local search and rescue team was mobilizing, but they needed someone who knew the old trails, the unmarked routes, the secret ways through the mountains. Ross hesitated. The request was specific. They needed him to lead a team into the northeast sector, the restricted zone around Mount Kitchai, the area he had sworn never to enter again. "There's a storm coming," the young ranger told him, earnest and worried. "If we don't find them by nightfall, they won't survive the night, temperatures dropping to -15. Ross thought of the agreement, of the vow he had made, never to return to that path. But he thought also of the hikers, cold and frightened, possibly injured, wandering in territory they didn't understand. Territory that was dangerous not just because of the terrain, but because of what lived in the shadows between the trees. "I'll do it," he said, "but we stay on the marked trails, no deviations, no shortcuts." The ranger agreed readily, grateful for help from someone with Ross's experience. They set out within the hour, a team of 6 following the maintained trail toward Mount Kitchai. The sky was gray and heavy, snow beginning to fall in fat, wet flakes that would turn to ice as the temperature dropped. They found the hikers at dusk, huddled together in a hollow, hypothermic but alive. Ross led the rescue team in, following protocol, keeping to the established routes. The evacuation went smoothly, the hikers wrapped in emergency blankets and assisted down the trail to waiting vehicles. It was over. The agreement was intact. Ross had entered the territory, yes, but he had not trespassed, had not violated the boundary, had not. "Bigfoot country, huh?" The voice came from behind him, one of the rescued tourists, a young man with a camera around his neck and a grin that spoke of urban ignorance. He was gesturing toward the tree line, toward the darkness that was gathering between the ancient trunks. Ross turned slowly. The young man was pointing at a broken branch, a depression in the moss, the kind of sign that inexperienced eyes might interpret as evidence of something large and unknown. "They say this is where the sightings happen," the tourist continued, oblivious to Ross's silence. "My buddy's cousin saw one here like 10 years ago. Massive thing, 8 feet tall, covered in hair. You believe in that stuff, Ranger?" Ross didn't answer. He was staring at the trees, at the shadows that seemed to be moving with purpose, gathering at the edge of the clearing where the rescue operation was winding down. The snow was falling harder now, visibility dropping, but Ross could see them, could feel them. They were watching. Not with hostility, not with the threat that had accompanied his first encounter, but with attention, with awareness. The Sasquatch knew he was here, knew he had entered their territory, however briefly, however respectfully, and they were reminding him that the agreement was still in force, that he was still bound by its terms. "Ranger," the tourist was looking at him strangely, "you okay?" Ross forced himself to smile, to nod, to make the appropriate noises of professional reassurance. "Fine," he said, "just thinking about the storm. We need to get these people to warmth." He turned away from the tree line, helping to load the last of the hikers into the rescue vehicle. As the engine started and the convoy began to move down the mountain road, Ross allowed himself one final look back. The trees were shuddering. Not from wind, the air was still, heavy with snow. The trunks were moving, swaying as if something massive was passing between them. Something that walked upright, that moved with silent grace, that watched the retreating vehicles with amber eyes that glowed in the gathering dark. Ross saw it, or thought he saw it. A shape, a silhouette standing at the boundary of the old-growth forest, watching, waiting, remembering. He climbed into the rescue vehicle and didn't look back again. As they drove down the mountain, the snow turning to sleet against the windshield, Ross Graham sat in silence and felt the weight of ancient eyes upon him. The agreement held, but it was fragile, temporary. A balance that could be shattered by a single misstep, a single word, a single moment of forgetfulness. And in the forest, in the deep places where the trees grew so close that sunlight never touched the ground, the Sasquatch waited. They had patience measured in centuries. They had memories that outlasted stone. They would be here when the last human had gone, when the last cabin had rotted to dust, when the last agreement had been forgotten. And on nights when the wind was right and the moon was full, they would still walk the paths that humans had abandoned, still place their markers on the boundaries of their territory, still watch. Always watch. For the forest was theirs, had always been theirs, would always be theirs. And Ross Graham, old man, retired ranger, signatory to an agreement he barely understood, knew that he would never truly escape their gaze. Not until the day he died. And perhaps, he thought, with a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind. Perhaps not even then. The old trail. The antique shop smelled of dust and time, of old paper and older wood, of the accumulated memories of 1,000 forgotten lives. It smelled of cedar chests that had held wedding dresses for 60 years, of leather-bound books whose pages had turned the color of tea, of the slow decay of objects that had outlived their owners and now waited, patient and silent, for someone to remember them. Austin Carr stood in the narrow aisle between shelves that towered toward a ceiling lost in shadow, his fingers trailing across surfaces that spoke of age and neglect. His hand brushed against the face of a clock that had stopped ticking in 1963, its hands frozen at 3:47, a moment preserved like an insect in amber. He touched the cold glass of mason jars filled with specimens he didn't want to examine too closely, things floating in yellowed liquid that might have been organs or might have been something worse. He felt the spines of books that had not been opened in decades, their titles embossed in gold that had faded to the color of old brass. He was 34 years old, a software engineer from Seattle who had discovered, 5 years into a career of code and cubicles, that he was slowly dying. Not physically. His annual physicals showed him to be disgustingly healthy, blood pressure perfect at 118/76, cholesterol ideal at 180 total, with HDL levels that his doctor called enviable, resting heart rate of 52, that suggested the cardiovascular system of an athlete rather than a man who spent 10 hours a day sitting in front of monitors. But spiritually, emotionally, existentially, Austin was withering. The gray walls of his office in the South Lake Union Tech corridor, the flickering screens that displayed lines of code until they burned themselves into his retinas, the endless meetings about meetings that consumed his days like a cancer consuming healthy tissue. They were draining something essential from him, something he couldn't name but knew he needed to recover before it was gone forever. The symptoms had started gradually, so slowly that he hadn't recognized them for what they were. A persistent fatigue that sleep couldn't cure, a sense of disconnection from his own life, as if he were watching himself from a distance, observing his actions without feeling them. A growing inability to find meaning in his work, which paid him $145,000 a year plus stock options, but left him feeling hollow and used up by Friday afternoon. He had tried the conventional remedies first. therapy, which had helped him understand his dissatisfaction without providing a cure, medication, which had flattened his emotions without restoring his joy, vacation, which had provided temporary relief that evaporated within hours of returning to his desk. He had changed jobs, moving from one tech company to another, hoping that different projects and different colleagues would reignite his passion. They hadn't. Then on a rainy Saturday in March, he had gone hiking. It was his friend Derek who suggested it, Derek who had watched Austin's decline with the concern of someone who had seen this before. "You need to get out of the city," Derek had said, pushing a brochure across the table at the coffee shop where they met every Saturday morning. "You need to remember what it feels like to be alive." The trail had been an easy one, a 4-mile loop through the foothills of the Cascades that was popular with families and casual walkers. Austin had gone reluctantly, expecting to be bored, expecting to spend the hike thinking about work, expecting to return to the city unchanged. Instead, he had found something he didn't know he'd lost. The forest had enveloped him like a blessing. The smell of pine and damp earth had filled his lungs with air that tasted of life itself. The sound of his boots on the trail, the rhythm of his breathing, the steady beat of his heart. He had felt his body for the first time in years, felt it as more than a vehicle for carrying his brain from meeting to meeting. He had walked the 4 miles in a state of something approaching meditation, his mind quiet for the first time in months, his thoughts flowing like the creek that ran beside the trail, rather than racing like the processors in the servers he maintained. He had returned to the city changed, not cured. He still felt the weight of his dissatisfaction, still struggled through his workdays, still woke at 3 a.m. with his heart racing from stressed dreams about missed deadlines and failed deployments. But he had found something that helped, something that made the rest of his life bearable. So he hiked, every weekend without fail, every vacation day, spent in the mountains rather than on beaches or in cities. Every stolen hour he could rest from the demands of his profession, devoted to walking through forests and climbing ridges, and standing on peaks where he could see the world spread out below him like a map of possibility. He had walked the Cascades, the Olympics again, the Coast Range, the Siskiyous. He had developed a reputation among his limited circle of hiking acquaintances as someone who sought the remote, the difficult, the paths that most weekend warriors avoided. He had standing invitations to join guided expeditions, to tackle the Pacific Crest Trail, to attempt the more challenging routes up Rainier and Hood and Baker. He had been offered spots on climbs that required technical skills he didn't possess, offered by people who assumed that his enthusiasm and fitness would translate to ability. But Austin preferred to walk alone. It was this preference that had brought him to Curiosities and Antiques, a shop in the small town of Aberdeen on the Washington coast that he had discovered by accident, his car having developed a mysterious ailment that the local mechanic couldn't diagnose until Monday. With 2 days to kill in a town with no attractions that he could find on Yelp or TripAdvisor, Austin had wandered the streets, seeking distraction, and found the shop with its hand-painted sign and its windows dark with dust. The sign above the door read EST, 1923, in faded gold letters, and Austin wondered if that was when the shop had opened or when it had last been cleaned. The windows were so coated with grime that he couldn't see inside, and for a moment he thought the place might be abandoned, another casualty of the changing economy, another small business that had closed its doors and kept its sign out of sentiment or neglect. But when he tried the door, it opened with a creak that sounded like the protest of ancient bones, and a bell above the lintel announced his entrance with a tone that was more dirge than welcome. The interior was worse than the exterior. The shelves that lined the walls were packed with objects that seemed to have been arranged without pattern or purpose, a hoarder's paradise of accumulated decades. There were taxidermied animals with glass eyes that followed Austin's movement, their fur matted and dusty, their poses suggesting agony rather than the natural grace they had possessed in life. There were dolls with porcelain faces and human hair that had been styled in fashions from the 1940s, their painted smiles fixed and terrible. There were tools whose purposes Austen couldn't guess, rusted implements that might have been for farming or surgery or torture. There were books, thousands of books, stacked on shelves and piled on floors, their spines cracked, their pages swollen with moisture. And there was the smell. The smell of dust, yes, but beneath that, other smells. The smell of old cloth that had absorbed the scents of 100 years of human habitation. The smell of wood that had dried and cracked and been polished with oils that had themselves turned rancid. The smell of something organic, something that might have been mold or might have been something that had died in the shop and never been found. Austen should have left, should have turned around and walked back into the sunlight, back to the present, back to the world he understood. But something held him there, some curiosity or compulsion that he couldn't explain. He moved deeper into the shop, his footsteps silent on a floor that was carpeted with dust so thick it felt like walking on snow. The proprietor was ancient, bent, with eyes that seemed to look through Austen rather than at him. He sat behind a counter that was itself an antique, a massive oak structure that might have been a bank teller's station in a previous century, now covered with objects that the old man was sorting with trembling hands. He looked up when Austen entered, nodded once, then returned to his work of polishing something that might have been a brass compass or might have been something else entirely. Austen browsed without expectation, killing time, waiting for his car to be repaired so he could return to his life. He looked at clocks that didn't work, at books with pages stuck together by time, at jewelry that had tarnished to the color of old blood. He found nothing that interested him, nothing that seemed worth the effort of carrying it back to his car. Then he found the map. It was tucked in a drawer beneath a display case, half hidden beneath a stack of yellowed newspapers from the 1950s. Austen wouldn't have found it at all if he hadn't dropped his phone, if he hadn't knelt to retrieve it from beneath the cabinet, if his fingers hadn't brushed against the drawer's edge and felt the strange texture of old paper. The drawer opened with a sound like a sigh, and Austen saw the map immediately. It was the only thing in the drawer, lying alone as if it had been placed there deliberately, as if someone had wanted it to be found. The map was drawn on vellum or something like vellum, thin, slightly translucent, with the soft give of animal skin rather than the crisp rigidity of paper. It felt warm in his hands, warmer than the air in the shop, as if it had been heated by some internal source. The edges were worn, soft from handling, and Austen could see that it had been folded many times, the creases so established that they had become part of the material. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers trembling with an excitement he couldn't explain. The map showed the Pacific Northwest, the familiar outline of Washington and Oregon, the jagged peaks of the Cascades, the sinuous course of the Columbia River. But there were details that Austen didn't recognize. Trails marked in faded ink that didn't appear on any modern topographical map. Symbols in the margins that might have been Native American, might have been something older. Notations in a hand that was barely legible, written in a language that Austen thought might be Latin or might be something that predated Latin entirely. And in the center of the map, deep in the wilderness of the Olympic Peninsula, a notation in English, written in the same faded ink as the rest of the map. The old trail, abandoned 1897, do not follow. Austen felt his heart begin to beat faster. He was not a superstitious man. He didn't believe in ghosts or curses or warnings from the past. He was a rational person, a man of science and technology, someone who trusted data and evidence over intuition and folklore. But he was also a man who sought the unknown, who craved the experience of discovery, who had walked every maintained trail in the region and was hungry for something new. The old trail, abandoned 1897, over a century since anyone had walked it, a path that had been forgotten by the modern world, erased from maps and memory, preserved only on this single piece of vellum that had somehow survived in the drawer of an antique shop on the Washington coast. "How much for this?" he asked, holding up the map. The old proprietor looked up from his polishing. His eyes, milky with cataracts, seemed to focus on the map with an intensity that made Austin uncomfortable. For a moment, the old man didn't speak, just stared at the map as if he were seeing a ghost, as if the vellum were a window into something he had tried to forget. "That one," the old man said, his voice like dry leaves rustling, like wind through dead branches, like the sound of time itself speaking. "That one is not for sale." "Everything in an antique shop is for sale," Austin countered, pulling out his wallet. He had $400 in cash, more than enough for a piece of old paper, no matter how interesting. "Name your price." The old man was silent for a long moment. His hand stopped their polishing, resting on the object on the counter, and Austin saw that it was indeed a compass, its needle spinning slowly even though there were no magnets nearby, no sources of interference that could explain its movement. "You don't understand," the old man said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "That map, it finds people, it calls to them. It has been in that drawer for 30 years, and in 30 years no one has opened that drawer. No one has even noticed it, until today, until you." Austin felt a chill run down his spine, a primitive response to the old man's words that his rational mind tried to dismiss as superstition. "I'm a hiker," he said, keeping his voice steady. "I collect old maps. This is exactly the kind of thing I look for. It's not supernatural, it's just coincidence." "Coincidence," the old man repeated, and his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile or might have been a grimace. "Yes, coincidence. That is what they want you to believe. That is how they lure you in, with coincidence, with curiosity, with the promise of discovery." "Who?" Austin asked. "Who are they?" The old man didn't answer. He just looked at the map, then at Austin, then back at the map. "I will sell it to you," he said finally, "but you must understand what you are buying. You are not buying a map to a place. You are buying a ticket to a meeting, and the things that wait at the end of that trail. They have been waiting for a very long time. They are patient. They are hungry, and they do not let go of those who come to them." Austin should have walked away, should have left the map in the drawer, left the shop, left the town, returned to his life of code and cubicles and the slow death of his spirit. But the map called to him. The mystery pulled at him. The promise of something unknown, something that no one had seen in over a century. It was irresistible. "Name your price," he said again. The old man named a figure that was absurdly low. $20. Less than the cost of a lunch in Seattle, less than the cost of a book, less than the cost of the gas Austin had burned driving to this town. Austin paid without haggling, tucking the map into his jacket with a sense of triumph that he couldn't quite explain. "You should listen to the warning," the old man said, as Austin turned to leave. "Some trails are forgotten for a reason." Austin smiled, polite and dismissive. "I've hiked trails that would make most people faint just looking at the elevation profile. I've walked through snow in August, forded rivers in flood season, navigated by compass when my GPS failed. I'm not worried about an old path in the Olympics." "It's not the trail you should fear," the old man said, and his eyes were no longer milky but clear, sharp, filled with a knowledge that terrified Austin more than anything he had ever seen. "It's what walks it." Austin left the shop with the map burning in his pocket, the old man's words already fading from his attention. He had a new trail to explore, a forgotten trail, a trail that no one had walked in over a century. He couldn't wait to see where it led. The research took 3 weeks. Austin approached the map with the same methodical precision he applied to debugging code, the same systematic thoroughness that had made him valuable to his employers. He scanned the map at 1200 dpi, creating a digital file that preserved every detail, every faded line, every symbol in the margins. He overlaid it on modern topographical maps, using GIS software to align the old trails with current geography. He searched historical records, Park Service archives, old newspaper accounts, university databases, anything that might contain information about trails in the Olympic Peninsula that had been abandoned in the 1890s. He started with the easy sources. The National Park Service maintained extensive records of trail maintenance, including histories of when trails had been opened, closed, rerouted, or abandoned. He submitted a Freedom of Information Act request for any documents related to trail closures in the 1890s, expecting to receive a polite letter explaining that no such records existed. Instead, he received a phone call. "Mr. Carr." The voice was female, professional, with the slight accent of someone who had grown up in the Pacific Northwest. "This is Margaret Chen from the Olympic National Park Archives. I'm calling about your FOIA request." "Yes," Austin said, surprised. He had expected a form letter, not personal contact. "I need to ask you some questions about your interest in these records," Chen said. "The trail you're asking about. It's not in our standard database. It's not in any database. The only reason I know about it is because of a reference in a 1923 Ranger report that I found in our uncatalogued materials." Austin felt his pulse quicken. "What does the report say?" There was a pause on the line, the sound of papers being shuffled. "I'd rather not discuss this over the phone," Chen said finally. "Can you come to Port Angels? I'd like to show you what we have. But I need to warn you, this isn't standard historical material. There are irregularities." Austin drove to Port Angels the next morning, leaving Seattle at 5 a.m. to make the 3-hour drive across the Hood Canal Bridge and up the Olympic Peninsula. The archives were located in a nondescript building near the park headquarters, and Chen met him at the door with a look of concern that made Austin's stomach tighten. She was in her 50s, gray-haired, with the weathered skin of someone who spent time outdoors. She led him to a back room, a climate-controlled space filled with filing cabinets and archival boxes, and pulled out a folder that was marked with a red tag that Austin didn't recognize. "This doesn't leave this room," she said, placing the folder on a table. "And I need you to sign a non-disclosure agreement before you look at it. The Park Service doesn't officially acknowledge the existence of this material." Austin signed the form, his hand shaking slightly with anticipation. Chen opened the folder and spread the contents across the table. There were newspaper clippings, yellowed and fragile, photographs, black and white, showing landscapes that Austin recognized from his map, handwritten reports, some in the precise script of official documents, others in the hurried handwriting of field notes, and maps, dozens of maps, some showing the trail in detail, others showing it as a dotted line that ended in question marks. "The old trail," Chen said, pointing to a map from 1885, "built by loggers in the 1870s to access timber in the interior valleys, used by miners, settlers, anyone who needed to get deep into the Olympics, and then in 1897 it was abandoned, officially because of hazardous conditions and unstable terrain. But that's not the real reason." She pulled out a newspaper article from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, dated October 14, 1897. The headline read, "Search called off, 3 men missing in Olympics." "William Hartley, Charles Monroe, and Thomas Blackwood," Chen read. "Experienced woodsmen, hunters, men who knew the Olympic Peninsula better than anyone. They went up the old trail in September 1897 to scout a new logging camp. They never came back." Austin read the article, his eyes scanning the faded text. The search had lasted 2 weeks. Search parties had found the men's camp, their equipment, their horses, but no bodies, no signs of struggle, no explanation for their disappearance. "The article mentions strange tracks," Austin said, pointing to a paragraph near the end. "Massive impressions unlike any known animal," Chen nodded. "That's in the official report too. The search leader, a man named Colonel James Abernathy, filed a confidential addendum that was only declassified in 1965. I've got a copy here." She pulled out another document, typewritten on official letterhead. Austin read it, his disbelief growing with every paragraph. Abernathy described tracks that were 18 inches long, shaped like human feet but far too large, pressed 2 inches into the forest floor as if made by something weighing hundreds of pounds. He described trees that had been stripped of bark at heights no animal could reach. He described sounds, wood knocks, he called them, rhythmic striking that seemed to be a form of communication. Abernathy recommended permanent closure of the trail, Chen said, and he recommended that the area be declared off-limits to all personnel. His recommendation was accepted, and the trail was erased from official maps, but people kept finding it. She pulled out more documents. A journal from a prospector, dated 1895, describing the wood knocks that kept him awake at night, the feeling of being watched from the trees, the shapes that moved at the edge of my vision. A letter from a homesteader's wife, dated 1894, mentioning the old ones in the trees who watched her children when they played too far from the cabin. The gifts they leave, stones stacked in patterns, branches woven into shapes. A series of reports from Forest Service rangers in the 1920s and 1930s, each describing unusual activity on the abandoned trail, each recommending permanent closure of sector, each ending with the same phrase, "Do not return." The pattern is consistent, Chen said. Every few decades someone finds the trail, they hike it, they experience something, and then they never go back. Some of them move away from the Pacific Northwest entirely. Some of them won't speak of what they saw. A few of them ended up in mental institutions. "You're saying the trail is dangerous," Austin said. "I'm saying the trail is something else," Chen replied. "I'm saying that the things that live in that forest are not bears or cougars or any animal that science recognizes. I'm saying that the Quinault people, who lived in these mountains for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, had stories about the stick Indians or forest devils, creatures that lived in the deep woods, that hunted humans, that could mimic voices and sounds to lure their prey." "Sasquatch," Austin said, trying to keep his voice neutral. "That's the modern term," Chen agreed. "But the Quinault stories are older than that name. They called them Saskits or something similar. The stories say they're not animals, they're something else. Something that was here before humans, that will be here after humans are gone. Something that owns the deep forest and doesn't like to be disturbed." Austin looked at the map in his jacket pocket, the vellum warm against his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Why show me these documents?" Chen was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her desk and pulled out a photograph. It showed a young woman, maybe 25, standing on a mountain trail, smiling at the camera. She looked happy, healthy, alive. "My sister," Chen said. "Margaret Chen, same name, 20 years younger. She was a hiker too. Found the old trail in 2003. Hiked it alone. Came back. Different. Wouldn't speak for 3 days. Then she told me what she saw, the creatures, the wood knocks, the chase. She moved to New York the next week. Changed her name. Cut off contact with everyone she knew. I found her last year living in a studio apartment in Queens, working as a cashier in a grocery store. She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't acknowledge who I was, just kept saying, 'They're still watching. They never stop watching.'" Austin felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry," Chen said, her voice hard. "Be smart. Burn the map. Forget you ever found it. Whatever is on that trail, whatever killed those men in 1897, whatever drove my sister mad, it doesn't want to be found. It doesn't want to be seen, and it punishes those who try." Austin left Port Angels with the documents Chen had copied for him, the warnings echoing in his mind. He should have listened, should have recognized the pattern of fear, the consistency of the warnings, the way that rational people became irrational when they spoke of the old trail. But he was a man possessed now, driven by a hunger for the unknown that had grown beyond his control. The trail called to him. The mystery pulled at him. He had to know what was there. Austin spent the next 2 weeks in obsessive preparation, telling himself that he was being thorough, being safe, being responsible. He wasn't preparing for a confrontation with monsters. He was preparing for a difficult hike in remote terrain. That was all. He upgraded his equipment, spending $2,000 on gear that he told himself was necessary for the conditions he would face. A new tent, ultralight but four-season rated, capable of withstanding winds up to 60 mph. A sleeping bag rated to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, overkill for September in the Olympics but better safe than sorry. A satellite phone with emergency beacon capability, rented at exorbitant cost but potentially life-saving if he encountered real trouble. A GPS unit with preloaded topographical maps and the ability to store his own waypoints. He planned his route with military precision. 3 days on the trail, he decided. Day 1, hike to the first campsite, establish base, explore the immediate area. Day 2, push deeper into the interior, find the lake that was marked on the old map, document everything he found. Day 3, return to the trailhead, exit the forest, drive back to civilization. Simple, straightforward, manageable. He told no one where he was going. Not his coworkers, who would think he was crazy for hiking alone in remote wilderness. Not his parents, who would worry. Not Derek, who would try to talk him out of it. He left a vague itinerary with his apartment manager. Hiking in the Olympics back Thursday. That would be enough to initiate a search if he didn't return, but not enough to lead anyone to the old trail specifically. He studied the map until he could trace its lines with his eyes closed. He learned the symbols in the margins, which Chen had identified as a mixture of Quinault pictographs and something older, something that might have been Celtic or might have been something that predated human writing entirely. He memorized the landmarks, the creek that marked the first campsite, the ridge that overlooked the lake, the stone cairn that indicated the trail's end. And he told himself over and over that he was being rational, that the stories were just stories, that the disappearances were accidents or hoaxes or the products of overactive imaginations, that he would hike the trail, find nothing unusual, and return with a story about an interesting historical discovery. He almost believed it. The drive to the trailhead took 6 hours, longer than Austin had anticipated due to road construction on Highway 101, and the slow going on the Forest Service roads that led to the abandoned logging area. He arrived at the turnoff at 3 p.m. on a Thursday in late September, the sky gray with the promise of rain, the air smelling of pine and impending autumn. The trailhead was unmarked, exactly as the map indicated. Austin parked his Subaru at the turnoff, shouldered his pack and checked his equipment one final time. GPS fully charged. Satellite phone tested, emergency beacon armed, water purification, first aid, bear spray, knife, food for 5 days in case of emergency. He was prepared for anything that rational planning could anticipate. He was not prepared for what he would find. The main trail was well maintained, a popular route that saw hundreds of hikers during the summer months. Austin walked it with a sense of anticipation that made his steps light, his breathing quick. He passed other hikers, exchanged nods and brief greetings, felt the familiar comfort of human presence in the wilderness. Then he saw the turnoff. It was exactly where the old map indicated, a narrow gap in the vegetation that would have been invisible if he hadn't been looking for it. The main trail continued straight, well-marked and well-traveled. The old trail branched off at a sharp angle, disappearing into undergrowth so thick that Austin could see only 5 meters into its depths. He checked his GPS. The device showed him standing at a blank space, a zone of insufficient data where the topographical maps had nothing to record. He was standing at the edge of the known world, about to step into the territory that the map makers had abandoned. The air felt different here. He noticed it immediately as he pushed through the first curtain of branches. The temperature dropped or seemed to. The quality of light changed, filtered through a canopy that was denser, older, more complete. The sounds of the main trail, the voices of other hikers, the distant sound of aircraft, the ever-present hum of civilization, faded and died. Austin was alone. The trail was overgrown but passable, a narrow track that wound through forest of increasing density and age. The trees here were giants, cedars and firs that had stood for centuries, their trunks wider than Austin's outstretched arms could reach. The undergrowth was sparse, choked out by the dense canopy above, but what grew was lush and ancient, moss that draped every surface, ferns that unfurled in the dim light, mushrooms that glowed with faint phosphorescence in the shadows. Austin walked for an hour, then two, following the trail as it climbed steadily toward the interior mountains. The beauty was overwhelming. This was old-growth forest, true wilderness, the kind of landscape that had existed unchanged for millennia. He had hiked in remote places before, but never in a place that felt this. He searched for the word. Primordial. The forest felt ancient in a way that transcended mere age. It felt timeless, eternal, as if the concepts of past and future had no meaning here, as if this place existed in a perpetual now that had never known human presence and would never welcome it. He found his first campsite in a clearing beside a creek, the water so clear that he could see every pebble on the bottom, so cold that his fingers went numb in seconds. The clearing was perfect, a natural flat spot surrounded by moss-covered boulders, with a view of the creek and the forest beyond. Austin set up his tent with practiced efficiency, gathered firewood, started his camp stove for dinner. The sun was setting, the light filtering through the canopy turning golden and then amber and then red. Austin sat by his small fire, watching the flames dance, feeling the peace that he had sought for so long. This was why he hiked. This moment. This connection to something larger than himself, something that didn't care about quarterly reports or performance reviews or the endless grind of modern existence. Then he heard it. A rustling in the undergrowth beyond the firelight. Slow, deliberate, not the scurrying of a small animal, not the wind moving through branches. Footsteps, heavy footsteps moving with purpose, circling his camp. Austin froze, his hand finding the bear spray at his belt. He was not afraid of wildlife. He had encountered bears before, black and brown, had faced down a mountain lion on a trail in the Cascades. He knew how to behave, how to make himself large, how to retreat slowly without triggering a predator's chase response. But this was different. The footsteps were too heavy for a cougar, too quiet for a bear. They moved with a rhythm that was almost human, a bipedal gait that paused, listened, continued. Austin could feel eyes on him, could sense attention focused on his small fire, his vulnerable position, his isolation. "Hello," he called out, his voice sounding small in the vastness of the forest. "Anyone there?" The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the crackle of his fire and the distant sound of the creek. Then, from the darkness, came a sound that made Austin's blood run cold. Thump. The sound of something striking wood. A heavy impact, rhythmic, deliberate, thump, thump, thump. Not random, patterned, a code or a language or a warning. Austin had read about wood knocks in his research, the phenomenon reported by Bigfoot enthusiasts, the sound of something intelligent striking trees to communicate. He had dismissed it as folklore, as misidentified animal behavior, as the product of overactive imaginations in the dark woods. But hearing it now, in this place at this time. The thumping stopped. The footsteps resumed, moving away, growing fainter until Austin could hear them no more. He sat by his fire until the fuel ran out, until the darkness pressed against his tent like a physical force, until exhaustion finally overcame fear and he slept. He dreamed of eyes, amber eyes, watching him from the darkness, eyes that belonged to something that stood on two legs and walked like a man but was not a man, eyes that were ancient and patient and hungry. He woke to gray dawn, his tent covered in condensation, his body aching from tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. The forest was silent, peaceful, ordinary. Birds sang. Insects buzzed. The creek murmured its endless song. He told himself it had been a bear, a large black bear, curious about his camp, striking a tree with its claws. The footsteps had been his imagination, amplified by fear and isolation. The wood knocks were a known phenomenon, explainable by natural causes. He packed his camp and continued up the trail. He would not turn back, not yet. The mystery pulled him forward, the need to know what lay at the trail's end overriding the warnings of his instincts. He was Austin Carr, experienced hiker, rational man, master of his own fate. He didn't yet understand that the trail was mastering him. That it had been from the moment he stepped onto it. That it would not let him go until it was finished with him. The trail grew steeper as Austin climbed, winding through terrain that became increasingly rugged and wild. The trees grew larger, their trunks so massive that he couldn't see their tops, their roots forming steps that he had to navigate carefully to avoid twisting an ankle. The undergrowth thickened, branches reaching across the path like skeletal fingers, moss hanging in curtains that brushed against his face as he passed. He checked his GPS every few minutes, watching his progress as a blue dot moving across a blank screen. The device showed his elevation, his coordinates, the time elapsed since he started, but it showed nothing of the terrain around him, no contour lines, no landmarks, no indication of what lay ahead. He was walking blind, trusting the old map and his own instincts to guide him. The forest changed as he climbed. The cedars gave way to firs, the firs to spruce, the spruce to hemlock. The air grew thinner, colder, scented with the sharp tang of evergreen resin. The silence deepened until Austin could hear his own heartbeat, his own breathing, the blood rushing in his ears. No birds sang. No insects buzzed. No wind moved through the branches. It was as if the forest were holding its breath. He stopped at noon to rest and eat, sitting on a fallen log that was covered in moss so thick it felt like a cushion. He ate trail mix and jerky, drank water from his bottle, tried to convince himself that he was being paranoid. The forest was just a forest. The silence was just the silence of remote wilderness. The feeling of being watched was just his imagination, fueled by the stories he had read and the warnings he had been given. But when he stood to continue, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was a mark on a tree about 8 feet off the ground. 4 parallel scratches, each one an inch deep, running vertically down the bark. They were fresh, the wood beneath them pale and exposed, the sap still oozing from the wounds, and they were too high for any bear, too deep for any natural cause. Austin photographed the marks with shaking hands, his camera's flash illuminating the scratches in stark detail. He told himself it was just a tree, just marks, just something that could be explained by wind or falling branches or any of 100 natural causes. But he didn't believe it. He walked faster after that, his eyes scanning the trees around him, his ears straining for any sound that didn't belong. The trail grew steeper, the switchbacks tighter, the forest darker. He passed through groves where the canopy was so complete that no light reached the ground, where he had to navigate by feel, his hands reaching out to guide him through the darkness. And then, suddenly, the trail opened up, and he found himself standing on the shore of the lake. It appeared without warning, the forest simply ending, the trees parting to reveal a body of water that shouldn't exist. Austin stopped, his breath catching in his throat, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. He knew this area, had studied the maps, both modern and historical. There was no lake here, no glacial body, no seasonal pond, no water feature of any kind. The topographical maps showed a ridge, a slope, a continuation of forest. The geological surveys showed bedrock, soil, drainage patterns that should have prevented any standing water from forming. But here was a lake, impossibly clear, impossibly blue, surrounded by cliffs that rose on 3 sides like the walls of a cathedral. The water was still, untouched by wind, reflecting the sky with perfect fidelity. It was beautiful, It was wrong. Austin approached the shore, his boots sinking into mud that was black and rich and smelled of decay. The silence here was absolute. No birds, no insects, no sound but his own breathing and the soft lapping of water against the shore. The lake was circular, about half a mile across, fed by streams that cascaded down the cliffs in silver ribbons. The water was so clear that Austin could see the bottom, could see rocks and sunken logs and something else, something that looked like bones, white and scattered, resting in the shallows near the shore. He should have turned back. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to return to the main trail, to the world of maps and GPS and human presence. But he was hypnotized by the lake's beauty, by its impossibility, by the mystery of its existence. He walked the shore, following the water's edge, and found the first sign that he was not alone. It was a structure, a crude shelter built from branches and moss leaning against a fallen log. Not a human construction. The branches were woven in patterns that suggested intelligence but not human intelligence. The structure was too large, the entrance too high, the proportions subtly wrong. The opening was oval, wider than it was tall, designed for something that didn't walk quite like a human. Austin photographed it with shaking hands. This was evidence, proof of something. He didn't know what, but he knew it was important. He continued around the lake, finding more signs. A pile of stones stacked in a cairn that reached nearly to his height, the rocks arranged in a spiral pattern that seemed to pulse with meaning he couldn't decipher. Marks on the trees, claw marks that were too high for any bear, too deep for any natural cause, forming patterns that might have been territorial markers or might have been warnings. And everywhere the sense of being watched, of being followed, of being hunted. It was mid-afternoon when he heard the thumping again. Thump, thump, thump. Closer this time, much closer, coming from the trees that lined the lake's edge, from the cliffs above, from multiple directions at once. Austin spun around, trying to locate the source, and saw movement in his peripheral vision. Something large, something upright, something that ducked behind a tree when he turned to look directly at it. He reached for his camera, his hands trembling. This was it, the moment he had been seeking, proof of the unknown, evidence that would change everything. He raised the camera, focused on the tree where he had seen the movement, and pressed the shutter. The flash illuminated the forest for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction of a second, Austin saw what was watching him. It was massive, 8 feet tall, maybe more, covered in dark matted fur that seemed to absorb the light. It stood upright, shoulders hunched, arms hanging to its knees, hands that ended in claws rather than fingers. And its face. The face was almost human, almost. The structure was there, the arrangement of features recognizable, but everything was distorted, stretched, wrong. The forehead sloped backward, heavy with bone. The jaw protruded, heavy with muscle, lined with teeth that were too large, too sharp, too numerous. And the eyes. The eyes reflected the camera flash like an animal's, amber, glowing, intelligent. The creature snarled, a sound like rocks grinding together, like trees falling, like the earth itself in pain. And then it moved. Austin ran. He didn't think, didn't plan. His body took over, the ancient survival instinct that predated consciousness, that cared nothing for evidence or discovery or understanding. He ran back along the shore, back toward the trail, his pack bouncing against his back, his boots slipping on the muddy ground. Behind him, the forest erupted. Not one set of footsteps, but many, crashing through the undergrowth, keeping pace with his flight. The thumping continued, faster now, excited, a drumbeat of pursuit that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Austin reached the trail and ran faster, his lungs burning, his legs pumping. The trail descended now, winding through the forest in switchbacks that he navigated by instinct, his eyes fixed on the ground before him, his mind empty of everything but the need to escape. The footsteps followed, always just behind, never catching up, never falling back. They were hurting him, Austin realized through the haze of terror, directing his flight, controlling his path. He ran for what felt like hours. The light faded, the forest growing dark around him, but he didn't dare stop, didn't dare look back. The footsteps were his world now, the rhythm of his existence, the metronome that measured his survival. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Austin stumbled to a halt, his chest heaving, his body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. He was in a clearing, his clearing, the place where he had camped the night before. The creek still babbled. The boulders still sat, moss-covered and ancient. But his fire pit was gone. Not extinguished. Gone. The stones he had arranged, the ashes he had scattered, the disturbed earth where he had burned his fuel, all of it was gone. The clearing looked as if no human had ever set foot in it, as if Austin had never been there. He turned in a slow circle, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The trail continued behind him, the way he had come, but ahead. Ahead the trail continued as well, but it was different now. The undergrowth was pressed down, broken, disturbed by something massive that had passed this way recently, very recently. And from the darkness between the trees, Austin heard the footsteps resume. Not behind him this time, in front of him, to his sides, surrounding him. He was trapped. The moon rose, full and bright, casting silver light across the clearing. And in that light, Austin saw what had been hunting him. They emerged from the trees slowly, deliberately, revealing themselves with a confidence that spoke of absolute power. 2 of them, maybe more in the shadows beyond. Massive figures 9 feet tall, shoulders hunched, arms dragging knuckles through the dirt. Their fur was dark, matted, alive with parasites that gleamed in the moonlight. Their faces were worse than the one he had seen at the lake. More distorted, more wrong. One of them opened its mouth, and Austin saw teeth like broken tombstones, black with decay. Too many of them crowded into gums that wept with infection. The creature raised one massive hand and struck a tree trunk. The sound was deafening, a crack that echoed through the forest like thunder. The tree shuddered, leaves raining down, and Austin saw that the trunk was cracked, splintered, damaged by the force of the blow. He was going to die here. The realization was calm, almost peaceful. He had sought the unknown, and the unknown had found him. He had trespassed where he was not welcome, and now he would pay the price. But the creatures didn't attack. They stood, watching him with those terrible amber eyes, and Austin realized they were waiting for something, waiting for him to move, to choose, to decide. Run, something whispered in his mind. Not his own thought, something else, something ancient and alien and amused. Run, little human. Show us your fear, feed us your terror. Austin ran. Not toward the trail he had followed in. Not toward the lake. He ran blindly, crashing through undergrowth that tore at his clothes and skin, not caring about direction, about destination, about anything but the need to escape the clearing and the creatures that watched from its edge. The forest erupted around him. The creatures moved, fast, faster than anything that large should be able to move, keeping pace with his flight without apparent effort. He could hear them on all sides, could feel their attention like a physical weight, but they didn't catch him, didn't stop him, just herded him. He ran until his lungs were on fire, until his legs were jelly, until he couldn't run anymore. He stumbled, fell, rolled to his back, expecting to see them standing over him, expecting to feel their claws, their teeth, their terrible strength. But they weren't there. The forest was silent. The footsteps had stopped. The only sound was his own ragged breathing, his own pounding heartbeat. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the canopy, waiting for the end. But nothing came. No attack, no pursuit, just silence. Slowly, carefully, he sat up. He was in a part of the forest he didn't recognize, far from any trail, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean toward him, their branches reaching down like fingers. The moon was high now, casting enough light that he could see his surroundings, could see that he was in a grove of ancient cedars. their trunks wider than cars, their roots forming a maze that he would have to navigate to escape. He checked his GPS. The device showed his location, but the map was blank. No trails, no landmarks, no indication of where he was or how to get back. He was lost. He stood, his legs trembling, and tried to get his bearings. The moon was in the east, which meant he needed to go west to reach the trailhead. But which way was west? The canopy was too dense to see the stars, and without the stars, he had no way to navigate. He started walking, choosing a direction at random, hoping that he would eventually find the trail or the creek or some landmark that he recognized. He walked for an hour, then two, the forest growing darker as the moon descended toward the horizon, the trees growing closer together, the undergrowth thicker. And then he heard it again. Thump, thump, thump. Close, very close, coming from the trees ahead of him. Austin froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He couldn't run anymore, couldn't fight, could only wait for whatever was coming. The thumping stopped. The forest was silent. Then, from the darkness ahead, came a sound that made Austin's blood freeze in his veins. It was his name. Austin. The voice was wrong. It sounded like his name, shaped by vocal cords that were almost human, but the intonation was off, the emphasis strange, as if the thing speaking had learned the word by listening but didn't understand what it meant. Austin, Austin, Austin. The voice came from multiple directions now, from the trees on his left, his right, behind him. They were surrounding him, closing in, and they were speaking his name. He ran again, not caring about direction, not caring about the branches that whipped his face, the roots that tripped his feet, the darkness that made every step a gamble with a twisted ankle or a broken leg. He ran until he couldn't run anymore, until he collapsed against a tree, gasping, sobbing, waiting for the end. And still they didn't come. He huddled against the tree, his body shaking with cold and fear, and waited for dawn. The night stretched on, hours that felt like days, the darkness absolute, the silence broken only by the occasional thump of wood on wood, the occasional whisper of his name from the darkness. He didn't sleep, couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, the amber eyes, the distorted faces, the teeth. Dawn came slowly, the gray light filtering through the canopy, revealing a forest that looked ordinary, peaceful, safe. The birds sang. The insects buzzed. The world woke to another day. Austin stood, his body aching, his mind numb, and tried to figure out where he was. He checked his GPS again, and this time it showed a trail, a thin blue line on the screen that hadn't been there before. The trail led west, toward the trailhead, toward his car, toward safety. He followed it, walking slowly, his legs weak, his pack feeling heavier than it ever had. The trail was overgrown, barely visible, but it was there, and it led in the right direction. He walked for hours, the sun climbing higher, the forest warming around him. He passed through groves that looked familiar, crossed streams that he recognized, saw landmarks that he had passed on his way in. And then he saw the clearing. His clearing, the place where he had camped the first night. The creek still babbled, the boulders still sat, moss-covered and ancient. But his tent was gone. Not packed up, not taken down, gone. The clearing looked as if he had never been there, as if the tent had never existed. He stood in the center of the clearing, turning in a slow circle, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. His tent, his sleeping bag, his equipment, his food, all of it was gone. The clearing was empty, pristine, untouched. Except for one thing. In the center of the clearing, where his tent had been, there was a pile of stones, arranged in a spiral pattern, the same pattern he had seen at the lake. And on top of the stones, placed carefully, deliberately, was his camera. Austin approached it slowly, his hands shaking. The camera was intact, undamaged, the memory card still inside. He turned it on, his fingers fumbling with the buttons, and scrolled through the photos. The lake, the trees, the creek, all normal, all explainable. Except the last one. The photo he had taken in the clearing, just before the chase. The camera had captured something he hadn't seen, something that had been watching from the foliage while he stood frozen in terror. A figure, blurred, half-hidden but unmistakable, massive, upright, covered in dark fur, and in its hand a club, a gnarled, twisted length of wood held with the casual grip of a tool often used, a weapon, a tool of killing. The creature was smiling. Austin dropped the camera, his hands shaking so badly he couldn't hold it. He backed away from the stone spiral, his eyes scanning the trees around him, waiting for them to emerge, waiting for the end. But nothing happened. The forest was silent. The creatures were gone. Or were they? He ran from the clearing, ran down the trail, ran toward the trailhead and his car and safety. He ran until his lungs were on fire, until his legs gave out, until he had to stop and rest. And when he stopped, he realized something that made his blood run cold. He was back at the clearing. Somehow, impossibly, he had run in a circle, had been herded in a circle. They were playing with him, hunting him, wearing him down. He tried again, choosing a different direction, running as fast as he could. And again, he ended up back at the clearing. The third time, he didn't run. He sat in the center of the clearing next to the stone spiral and waited. If they were going to kill him, let them kill him. He was too tired to run anymore. The sun climbed higher, reached its zenith, began to descend. Austin sat motionless, waiting. And then he heard it. Footsteps, heavy footsteps, approaching from the trail. Not the stealthy footsteps of the creatures, but the normal footsteps of a human hiker. "Hello," a voice called. "Is someone there?" Austin stood, his legs trembling, and saw a figure emerging from the trees. A man, middle-aged, wearing hiking gear, carrying a pack. A normal human hiker on a normal trail in a normal forest. "Help," Austin croaked, his voice barely audible. "Please help me." The man approached, his face concerned. "Are you okay? You look terrible." "I need to get out of here," Austin said. "Please, can you help me find the trailhead?" Sure, the man said. "I'm heading that way myself, but are you hurt? Do you need medical attention?" "Just get me out of here," Austin said. "Please." The man nodded, putting an arm around Austin's shoulder, supporting him as they walked. "What happened to you? Get lost?" "Something like that," Austin said. They walked for an hour, maybe two, Austin's mind too exhausted to track time. The man talked constantly, filling the silence with stories about his own hikes, his own adventures, his own close calls with wildlife. And then suddenly, they were at the trailhead. Austin's car was there, parked where he had left it, looking normal and safe and impossibly far from the nightmare he had experienced. The man helped him to the car, opened the door, helped him inside. "You sure you don't want me to call someone?" the man asked. "You really don't look good." "I'm fine," Austin lied. "Just need to get home." "Okay," the man said, stepping back. "Take care of yourself." Austin fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the ignition. The engine turned over, caught, roared to life. He looked up, ready to thank the man, to ask his name, to offer to pay him for his help. But the man was gone. Austin scanned the trailhead, the parking area, the road. No sign of the man, no sign that anyone had ever been there. He put the car in drive and floored the accelerator. He didn't stop until he reached the highway, until he saw the lights of the city, until he was surrounded by human habitation and the comforting illusion of safety. Austin drove through the night, stopping only for gas and coffee, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, his mind replaying the events of the past 3 days in an endless loop. He couldn't think about what had happened, couldn't process it, could only drive, putting miles between himself and the forest, between himself and the things that had hunted him. He reached Seattle at dawn, the city waking around him, the normalcy of traffic and pedestrians and buildings like a balm on his shattered nerves. He drove to his apartment, parked in his assigned space, rode the elevator to his floor. The familiar surroundings, the hallway carpet, the numbered doors, the smell of someone's cooking, they anchored him, reminded him that the world he knew still existed. He unlocked his door, stepped inside, and locked it behind him. 3 locks, deadbolt, chain, security latch. He had never used all 3 before. Now he couldn't imagine not using them. He showered for an hour, the water as hot as he could stand, scrubbing his skin until it was red and raw. He washed his hair 3 times, trying to get the smell of the forest out, the smell of moss and pine and something else, something musky and animal that seemed to cling to him despite the soap and water. He dressed in clean clothes, threw his hiking gear in the trash, and sat on his couch staring at the wall. He should eat, should sleep, should do something normal, but he couldn't move, couldn't think, could only sit waiting for the fear to subside. It didn't. He called in sick to work, something he hadn't done in 5 years. Food poisoning, he told his manager. I'll be out for a few days. The lie came easily, naturally. He was getting good at lying. He spent the first day in his apartment, curtains drawn, lights on, jumping at every sound. The refrigerator cycling on, the pipes expanding in the walls, the footsteps of his neighbor in the hallway. Each noise was a potential threat, each shadow a hiding place for something that shouldn't exist. He tried to tell himself it was over, that he was safe, that the creatures were in the forest, in the mountains, in the wilderness where they belonged. They couldn't reach him here, in the city, in his apartment, in his life. But he didn't believe it. On the second day, he developed the photos. He had taken the memory card to a private lab, one that promised discretion and confidentiality, paid extra for rush processing, waited in the parking lot while the technician did his work. The photos were ready in an hour, printed on glossy paper, placed in a manila envelope that felt heavy with significance. He took them back to his apartment, spread them across his kitchen table in the harsh light of the overhead fixture, and looked at what he had captured. The first photos were normal, the trailhead, the main trail, the turnoff, the forest, all explainable, all ordinary, all the kind of photos that any hiker might take. Then came the photos from the first campsite, the creek, the boulders, the tent, all normal, all expected. But there was one photo that he didn't remember taking, a photo of the clearing at night taken with flash showing the trees around his camp, and in the trees barely visible a shape, a dark shape, upright, watching. He hadn't seen it when he took the photo, hadn't known it was there, but the camera had captured it, the flash illuminating what the darkness had hidden. He moved to the photos from the second day, the hike to the lake itself, the shelter by the shore, the cairn, all documented, all real, all evidence of what he had seen. Then came the photo from the clearing, the one he had taken just before the chase, the one that had captured the creature watching from the trees. He looked at it now in the harsh light of his kitchen and saw details that he hadn't noticed before. The creature wasn't just watching, it was communicating. Its hand was raised, fingers spread in a gesture that might have been greeting or might have been warning. Its mouth was open, showing those terrible teeth, but the expression wasn't aggressive. It was smiling. The creature was smiling at him. Austin dropped the photo, his hands shaking. He backed away from the table, his eyes scanning the room, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows. But his apartment was empty, just him and the photos and the knowledge of what was out there. He gathered the photos, all of them, and burned them in his fireplace. Watched the flames consume the evidence, the proof, the only link to the reality he had experienced. The glossy paper curled and blackened, the images melting into ash, the truth becoming smoke that rose up his chimney and dissipated into the Seattle sky. He told himself it was over, that he was safe, that the creatures had let him go and would not come for him again. But he knew, In the deep places of his mind, in the darkness of his dreams, he knew. They were still watching. The dream started that night. Austin had always been a sound sleeper, the kind of person who could fall asleep within minutes of lying down and wake 8 hours later refreshed and ready for the day. But now sleep was a battle, a struggle against the images that waited behind his closed eyes. He dreamed of the forest, of the lake, of the clearing, but in his dreams the creatures were closer, more real, more terrible. He dreamed of waking in his tent to find them surrounding him, their amber eyes glowing in the darkness, their breath hot and foul. He dreamed of running through the forest, his legs heavy, his progress slow, while they kept pace with him effortlessly, never catching, never falling back, just watching. He dreamed of the lake, but in his dreams the water was black, not blue, and the things that lived beneath the surface were visible, white shapes that moved with purpose, that reached up for him with hands that were almost human. He dreamed of the man who had helped him, the hiker who had guided him to the trailhead. But in his dreams, the man's face changed as he walked, the features shifting, stretching, becoming wrong. The man's eyes turned amber. His teeth grew too large, and when he turned to smile at Austin, it was the smile of the creature in the photo. Austin woke from these dreams screaming, his sheets soaked with sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He would turn on all the lights, check every corner of his apartment, verify that he was alone. And then he would sit, shaking until dawn, afraid to close his eyes, afraid to sleep. He went to a doctor, a psychiatrist, told her about the dreams, about the anxiety, about the fear that wouldn't leave him. She prescribed sleeping pills, anti-anxiety medication, therapy. He took the pills, attended the sessions, tried to explain what had happened without sounding crazy. "I was hiking," he told the therapist, a kind woman with gray hair and a soothing voice. "I got lost. I saw something that scared me. Now I can't stop thinking about it." "What did you see?" she asked. Austin opened his mouth to tell her, to describe the creatures, the lake, the chase, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't say it, couldn't make it real by speaking it aloud. "I don't know," he lied. "It was dark, I was scared, I imagined things." The therapy didn't help. The medication didn't help. Austin continued to function, going to work, eating meals, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But inside, he was crumbling. The fear was eating him from the inside, consuming his sanity, his peace, his life. He stopped hiking, obviously, sold his equipment on Craigslist, canceled his subscriptions to outdoor magazines, unfollowed the hiking blogs and forums he had once frequented. He moved to a different apartment, one in a high-rise with security and cameras and other people always nearby. He changed his routine, stopped going out after dark, avoided parks and trees and anything that reminded him of the forest. But he couldn't escape the memories. They followed him everywhere, waiting in the quiet moments, the empty hours, the darkness before dawn. It was 3 weeks after his return when Austin started noticing the signs. Small things at first, things he could dismiss as coincidence, as imagination, as the product of a mind still traumatized by what it had experienced. A thump from the apartment above him, late at night. Just someone dropping something, he told himself, just the building settling. A shadow in the corner of his vision, moving quickly, gone when he turned to look. Just a trick of the light, just his tired eyes. A smell in the hallway, musky and animal, that reminded him of the forest. Just someone's pet, just the garbage chute. But the signs grew more frequent, more insistent, harder to ignore. He found scratches on his apartment door, 4 parallel lines, too high for a dog, too deep for a key. The building manager said it was probably vandalism, kids in the building, nothing to worry about. But Austin knew, he knew. He heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door, heavy footsteps that paused, listened, continued. But when he looked through the peephole, no one was there. He woke one night to find his window open, the screen removed, the night air flowing into his apartment. He lived on the 8th floor. There was no fire escape, no balcony, no way for anyone to reach his window from outside. But it was open. He closed it, locked it, pushed his dresser in front of it, and sat in the corner of his room, shaking until dawn. The next day he found the stones. They were on his kitchen table, arranged in a spiral pattern. 5 stones, smooth and round, placed carefully, deliberately, in the exact pattern he had seen at the lake. He hadn't put them there, hadn't brought them into his apartment, had never seen them before. But they were there. He swept them into the trash, took the trash to the chute, watched them fall into the darkness below. But when he returned to his apartment, they were back on the table, arranged in the same spiral, waiting for him. He moved again, broke his lease, paid the penalty, found a new apartment in a different part of the city. He told himself it was over, that he had left the signs behind, that he was safe. But on his first night in the new apartment, he heard the thumping. Thump, thump, thump. Coming from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor below. He turned on all the lights, checked every corner, found nothing. But the thumping continued, rhythmic, deliberate, a code he couldn't decipher. He called the police, told them someone was in his apartment making noise, harassing him. They came, searched, found nothing. Suggested he see a doctor, suggested he get some rest. He didn't call them again. It was a month after his return when Austin realized the map was gone. He had kept it in a drawer in his desk, the vellum folded carefully, protected from light and moisture. He hadn't looked at it since his return, hadn't wanted to look at it, but something made him check the drawer, some compulsion he couldn't explain. The drawer was open. Not all the way, just an inch, just enough to see that something was wrong. Austin approached the drawer slowly, his heart hammering, his hands shaking. He pulled it open the rest of the way and saw what he had feared. The map was gone. Not misplaced, not lost, gone. The drawer was empty except for a few pens and paper clips, the space where the map had been now vacant, waiting. He searched his apartment, tearing through drawers and closets, under beds and behind furniture. The map was nowhere. It had vanished. He sat on his couch, staring at the empty drawer, and understood. They had come for it, had entered his home, his sanctuary, his place of safety, had taken the map back, reclaiming what was theirs. Or had they taken it to give to someone else, to lure another hiker, another seeker, another victim to the old trail? Austin thought of the antique shop, of the old proprietor, of the way the map had waited in that drawer for 30 years until Austin had found it. Was that how it worked? The map found people, called to them, drew them to the trail where the creatures waited. And now it was gone, off to find its next victim. Austin wanted to warn someone, to tell the world about the trail, about the creatures, about the danger. But who would believe him? What words could convey the reality of what he had seen? He could post online, tell his story on forums and social media, but he would be dismissed as crazy, as a hoaxer, as another Bigfoot enthusiast with blurry photos and wild claims. He would become a joke, a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when you spend too much time alone in the woods. Or worse, he would attract attention, the wrong kind of attention, people who would want to find the trail, to see the creatures, to capture proof of what lived in the forest, and they would die, just like the men in 1897, just like the others who had found the trail and never returned. He couldn't be responsible for that, couldn't have more blood on his hands. So he stayed silent, kept his secret, bore his burden alone. Austin changed after that, changed in ways that were visible to everyone who knew him, though they didn't know why. He quit his job, couldn't concentrate, couldn't code, couldn't sit in meetings and pretend to care about quarterly projections. He cashed out his stock options, lived off his savings, told people he was taking time to find himself. He stopped seeing his friends, stopped answering calls, stopped responding to texts, stopped going to the coffee shop on Saturdays. Derek tried to reach him, came to his apartment, knocked on his door. Austin didn't answer, couldn't face the questions, the concern, the friendship that he no longer deserved. He moved again, and again, never staying in one place for more than a few months, always looking over his shoulder, always listening for the thumping. He lived in hotels, in short-term rentals, in places where he could leave quickly if the signs appeared. But the signs always appeared. The thumping, the scratches, the stones, the smell. They followed him wherever he went, reminders that he was marked, that he was claimed, that he belonged to them now. He tried to leave the Pacific Northwest, drove south to California, east to Montana, north to Canada, but he couldn't stay away. Something pulled him back, some compulsion that he couldn't resist. He would drive for hours, days, and then find himself turning around, heading back, drawn to the mountains and the forests like a moth to flame. He never went back to the trail, never hiked again, but he couldn't leave the region entirely, couldn't escape the pull of the wilderness that had claimed him. He took a job as a night security guard, working in an office building where he could sit in a room with cameras and monitors, surrounded by light and people, safe from the darkness outside. He slept during the day when the sun made the world feel safe, and worked at night when the city was awake and alive. He told himself he was managing, coping, surviving. But he knew the truth. He was waiting for them to come for him, to finish what they had started, to claim what was theirs. It was 6 months after his hike when Austin saw the article. He was browsing the internet, killing time during his shift, when a headline caught his eye: "Hiker missing in Olympics. Search called off." He clicked on the link, his hands shaking, his heart hammering. The article was brief, just the facts. A 28-year-old man named David Chen had gone hiking in the Olympic Peninsula 3 weeks ago and never returned. He had told friends he was following an old trail he had found in an antique shop. Search parties had found his car at an abandoned trailhead, his equipment scattered in a clearing, but no sign of the man himself. The article mentioned strange tracks found near the clearing, massive impressions unlike any known animal. Austin closed his laptop, his vision swimming, his stomach churning. David Chen, the nephew of Margaret Chen, the archivist who had warned him, the man who had taken the map, or another map like it, and followed it to the same fate that awaited all who walked the old trail. Austin wanted to call Margaret to warn her, to tell her what he knew, but what could he say? How could he explain? He did nothing, said nothing, just sat in his security room, watching the monitors, waiting for the end. It was a year after his hike when they came for him. Austin was living in a studio apartment in Tacoma, working as a cashier in a grocery store, the lowest point of a life that had once held so much promise. He had given up on security, on safety, on the illusion that he could escape what was coming. He woke to the sound of thumping, not from the walls, not from the ceiling, from outside his window. He lived on the 3rd floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, no way for anyone to reach his window from outside. But the thumping continued. Thump, thump, thump. Austin lay in his bed, frozen, his eyes fixed on the window. The curtains were drawn, but he could see a shape behind them, a massive shape, blocking out the light from the street lamp outside. He should run, should scream, should do something. But he couldn't move, could only watch as the window slid open, the lock turning from the outside, the curtains parting to reveal what stood on the ledge. It was one of them, the creatures, the Sasquatch, the old ones of the forest. It filled the window, 9 feet tall, shoulders hunched, arms hanging to its knees. Its fur was matted, filthy, alive with things that moved in the moonlight. Its face. Its face was the same one from his dreams, the same one from the photo, the same one that had smiled at him from the trees. The creature didn't move, didn't enter, just stood there watching him with those terrible amber eyes. And then it spoke. "Austin, The voice was wrong. Like his name spoken by vocal cords that were almost human, the intonation strange, the emphasis wrong. But it was his name. It knew his name. Austin, you came to us, you saw us. You belong to us now. Austin found his voice, though it came out as a whisper. What do you want? The creature smiled, showing those terrible teeth. We want what is ours. We want what you promised. I didn't promise anything. You came to our trail. You walked our path. You saw our lake. You are marked, Austin. You are claimed. And now it is time to come home. I'm not going anywhere, Austin said, his voice stronger now, defiant. The creature's smile widened. You don't have a choice. It reached through the window, one massive hand extending toward him, the claws catching the moonlight. Austin scrambled back, pressing himself against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. And then the creature stopped. Its hand paused in midair, its head tilted, as if listening to something Austin couldn't hear. Not yet, it said, and its voice was different now, layered as if multiple voices were speaking at once. You have time, a little time, but we are watching, Austin. We are always watching, and when the time comes, you will come to us. Willingly. The creature withdrew its hand, stepped back from the window, and was gone. Austin sat against the wall, shaking for the rest of the night. When dawn came, he approached the window, looked out at the empty ledge, the street below, the normal world going about its normal business. There was no sign that anything had been there, no scratches on the ledge, no marks on the window, no evidence that the creature had ever existed. But Austin knew. He packed his bags that morning, quit his job, closed his bank account, bought a bus ticket to anywhere, nowhere away. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know if it would matter. They would find him wherever he went. The trail had marked him, the forest had claimed him. But he had to try, had to run, had to fight. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Austin rode the bus for 3 days, heading east, then south, then west again, never staying in one place for more than a few hours. He slept in bus stations, in all-night diners, in the seats of moving vehicles where he could keep going, keep running, keep ahead of what was coming. But he couldn't outrun it. In Denver, he heard the thumping in the hotel wall. In Phoenix, he found stones arranged in a spiral on his pillow. In Los Angeles, he saw one of them standing on a street corner, watching him from across the traffic, its massive form somehow invisible to the people walking past. He kept moving, kept running, but he knew it was futile. They were letting him run, letting him think he had a chance, playing with him the way a cat plays with a mouse before the kill. He ended up in Portland, back in the Pacific Northwest, back where it had all started. He didn't know why he came back. Some compulsion he couldn't resist. Some part of him that knew the end was near and wanted to face it on familiar ground. He found a job in a bookstore, the kind of place that sold old books and maps and curiosities. The kind of place that reminded him of the shop in Aberdeen where he had found the map. He worked the register, helped customers, tried to live a normal life, but he knew it was temporary, knew that the end was coming. And then one day, a customer came in. A young man, maybe 25, with the look of someone who spent time outdoors. He browsed the shelves, picked up a book on hiking trails, put it down, picked up a map of the Olympics, unfolded it, studied it. "Do you have any older maps?" he asked Austin. "Historical ones." Austin felt his blood run cold. "Why do you ask?" "I'm looking for a specific trail," the young man said. "One that isn't on the modern maps. An old trail, abandoned in the 1890s. Austin stared at him, his mind racing. "Where did you hear about this trail?" The young man smiled, a friendly, open smile. "An antique shop up the coast. The owner told me about it. Said he had a map, but it was already sold." "Who bought it?" Austin asked, though he knew the answer. "Some guy from Seattle, a hiker. The owner said he warned him not to go, but the guy didn't listen." Austin felt the world tilt, the floor drop away beneath him. What was the guy's name? I don't know, but the owner said he came back changed, wouldn't speak for weeks, moved away. The young man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. The owner also said something else. He said the trail finds people, that the map calls to them, that once you've seen it, you can never really leave. Austin looked at the young man, really looked at him and saw something in his eyes, something amber, something ancient. "You're one of them," Austin whispered. The young man's smile widened, and his teeth were too large, too sharp, too many. "We all are, Austin, we all are." He reached across the counter, his hand changing as it moved, the fingers lengthening, the nails becoming claws. "It's time to come home." Austin didn't run, didn't fight. He knew it was over, had known since the first night in the forest, since the first wood knock, since the first sight of those amber eyes. He had been marked, he had been claimed. And now it was time to pay the price. He took the creature's hand, felt the strength in its grip, the warmth of its skin. The world around him faded, the bookstore dissolving into forest, the city giving way to wilderness, the present becoming the eternal now of the old trail. He walked with the creature into the trees, into the darkness, into the forest that had been waiting for him since the moment he first stepped onto the trail. Behind him, the bookstore was empty, the door locked, the lights off. No one would remember Austin Carr. No one would miss him. He would become another disappearance, another mystery, another warning that no one would heed. The trail would remain, waiting for the next seeker, the next curious soul, the next victim who thought they could discover the unknown and escape unchanged. The map would find them, the creatures would watch them, and they would come, willingly or not, to join the others in the forest, where they would walk forever, on the old trail, in the company of the ancient ones. Never aging, never dying, just walking. Forever. Thank you for listening to tonight's stories. If you enjoyed them, please leave a like and subscribe.